He should be grateful I even stayed there. That place was falling apart, and honestly, he's too slow to keep up with the real world.
In more than 40 years on this bench, I have learned that the law is not really about paper, codes, or gavels. It is about power. It is about what people do when they think the rules are for other people, and that their status exempts them from common decency. I thought I had seen everything after all these years in Providence, but then one Tuesday morning, a case walked into my courtroom that felt like a collision between predatory arrogance and fragile dignity. You might be watching this because you want to see justice, but what happened next is the kind of thing that reminds you why the law still has a soul. I still see the face of the man who was mocked, and I still hear the silence that filled the room right before I spoke. There are cases a judge forgets by lunchtime, and then there are the rare ones that sit in your chest and stay there long after the lights in the courthouse go out. This was one of those. At my age, you do not rush the morning, you honor it. I wake up at 5:30 a.m. every day without an alarm because my body knows the weight of the responsibility I carry. I slip out of bed carefully so I do not wake my wife, Joyce. After nearly 50 years of marriage, you learn to respect the quiet moments before the world begins to demand your attention. I head to the kitchen to make my coffee exactly how my father did, strong and black. My father used to say that if coffee needs help, then it is not coffee. I can still hear his voice every time I lift the mug. He came to this country from Italy with $8 in his pocket and calluses on his hands. He worked in construction and knew what it was like to be talked down to because of his accent. He told me, "Francesco, when life gives you power over people, use it wisely. Use it with mercy, because one day you will need mercy too." That morning, the sky over Providence was gray and heavy with the scent of rain. I stood by the window and watched the city wake up, thinking about the quiet heroes who are already at work before the rest of the world opens its eyes. By 8:15 a.m., I was at my desk. Christina, my clerk for over 20 years, slid a manila folder toward me. She didn't say much, but the way she paused told me this file was different. The case was a landlord-tenant dispute, but as I opened the file, I realized it was much more than that. It was case number 88219, Victor Henderson versus Julian Thorne. Victor was an 4-year-old retired teacher who had spent his life serving the community. Julian was a 8-year-old man who looked like he had never known a day of hard labor in his life. The charges included months of unpaid rent, property damage, and repeated verbal harassment. When I took the bench, I saw them. Victor sat in the third row, clutching a worn folder with trembling hands. He looked like a man who had been pushed to his limit but was trying to keep his dignity intact. Across from him sat Julian, dressed in a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than Victor's monthly pension. He was leaning back, checking his gold watch, and smirking at his friends in the gallery, as if the courtroom were a stage for his performance. The air in the room felt tight. You could see the truth before anyone even spoke. On one side was a man who had built a life through grit and duty, and on the other was a young man who wore entitlement like a shield. Julian wasn't just there for a legal matter, he was there to show everyone that he thought he was untouchable. He didn't realize that in this room, the only thing that matters is the weight of your character. By 10:47 am, the tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point that no air conditioning could cool. Christina called the case with the same professional detachment she had used for 20 years, but I noticed her hand linger on the folder just a second longer than usual. Case number 88219, Victor Henderson versus Julian Thorne. It was time for the performance of entitlement to meet the reality of the law. Julian Thorne stood up slowly, as if the very act of rising was a personal favor to the court. His lawyer, a man in a sharp charcoal suit named Jonathan Pierce, rose with him, wearing a practiced smile that usually costs $500 an hour. Julian didn't even bother to look at me. He was still thumbing through a notification on his phone. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady, and told him to put the phone away. He didn't say, "Yes, Your Honor." He just muttered, "Sure," and slid it into his pocket with a look of mild annoyance. The lawyer started immediately, trying to frame the situation before the truth could take its first breath. He called it a minor administrative misunderstanding regarding the lease agreement and property maintenance. A misunderstanding, I have heard that word used to describe everything from a missed payment to a violent assault. It is the favorite word of people who want to scrub the blood off their hands without using any soap. I turned my attention to Victor Henderson. He stood at the other table, his shoulders hunched, looking like a man who had been carrying the weight of the world alone. He had been a landlord for 30 years, and this was the first time he had ever stepped foot in my courtroom. He wasn't there because he wanted money. He was there because he was exhausted. He told me, with a voice that wavered but never broke, that he had rented the garden apartment to Julian because he wanted to help a young professional get a start in the city. Victor explained that for the first 3 months, everything was fine, but then the payments stopped. Then the noise complaints started coming in from the neighbors at 3 in the morning. When Victor tried to speak to him, Julian didn't just ignore him, he laughed. He told the elderly man that his time was up and that the world belonged to people who actually knew how to use it. Julian had even recorded a video of himself mocking Victor's slow walk, posting it online for his thousands of followers to see. As Victor spoke, Julian leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer, both of them sharing a brief, hushed chuckle. That was the moment I felt that familiar surge of cold anger in my chest. It wasn't because they disrespected the bench. It was because they sat there acting as if the life of an 84-year-old man was just a punchline to a joke they were telling. They thought that because Victor was old and quiet, he was also weak. I asked Julian if he had anything to say about the months of unpaid rent or the documented damage to the property. He shrugged his shoulders, adjusted his expensive watch, and said that he felt the apartment wasn't being maintained to his standards and therefore he shouldn't have to pay full price. He said it with such casual confidence that you could almost believe he thought he was the victim. He looked at Victor like he was an insect on a windshield, something that was just in his way. In this courtroom, everyone is equal under the law, but that does not mean every story carries the same weight. I sat back and looked at the two of them, the man who had spent his life teaching and building, and the young man who had spent his life consuming and mocking. The lawyer tried to interrupt, offering to settle for a fraction of the debt as a gesture of goodwill. I didn't even look at him. I kept my eyes on Julian, watching the smirk slowly fade as he realized that the usual doors were not going to open for him today. The courtroom remained so quiet that you could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the back wall, a sound that usually signals the arrival of the truth. I opened the supplemental file that Christina had prepared, which contained a series of digital exhibits submitted by Victor's granddaughter. Julian Thorne's lawyer tried to object before I could even look at the first page, claiming the evidence was gathered without consent and violated his client's privacy. I didn't look up from the folder. I simply told him that in this room, we prioritize the reality of harm over the comfort of the harasser. The first exhibit was a screen capture from Julian's social media account, posted just 3 days prior. It showed a high-definition video of Victor Henderson struggling to carry a heavy bag of trash to the curb. In the video, you can hear Julian's voice from behind the camera, laughing and calling Victor a walking fossil who was clogging up the hallway with the smell of the 1940s. Julian had even added a filter to make the elderly man look even more frail, mocking the way his hands shook as he gripped the plastic bag. The caption read, "Waiting for the vacancy. Old man can't even breathe, let alone fix a leak. New-gen tenant life." I watched the video twice, and each time, the cold weight in my chest grew heavier. I looked at Julian, who was now checking his reflection in the screen of his silenced phone, completely unbothered by the fact that his cruelty was being displayed for the world to see. He didn't see a human being in that video. He saw a prop for his digital audience. I asked Julian if he recognized the voice in the recording. He gave a sharp, dry laugh and said that everyone was being too sensitive and that it was just content. He actually used that word content to describe the humiliation of a man who had taught 3 generations of children in this very city. Victor sat there, his head bowed, looking at his own weathered hands. He whispered that it wasn't the unpaid rent that kept him awake at night, but the feeling that he no longer mattered in the house he had built with his own sweat. He told the court about his late wife, Martha, and how they had saved every penny for 20 years to buy this property. It was supposed to be their legacy, a place of peace. Now, he felt like a prisoner in his own home, afraid to walk down his own stairs because he knew Julian would be there with a camera, waiting to turn his struggle into a joke for strangers. The lawyer tried to pivot. suggesting that Julian had creative differences with the landlord and that the video was performance art protected by free speech. I set the folder down and took off my glasses, a gesture that my regular staff knows means the time for legal maneuvering has ended. I told the lawyer that free speech does not grant a license to strip another human being of their dignity for the sake of a few likes on a screen. I asked Julian how much he paid for his designer tracksuit, and when he proudly answered $3,000, I looked at the record of his unpaid rent, which totaled exactly that amount for the last 2 months. There is a specific kind of ugliness that emerges when a person uses their wealth to buy luxury while using their power to deny others basic respect. Julian didn't understand that the numbers on his bank statement didn't make him superior. They only made his failure of character more visible. I noticed a young woman in the back of the gallery, likely a student of Victor's from years ago, wiped a tear from her eye as she listened to the retired teacher describe his fear. The room wasn't just watching a trial anymore. They were witnessing a moral crisis. Julian still had that smirk, but it was starting to look brittle, like glass about to crack under the pressure of a truth he couldn't outrun. Just as Julian was leaning back to whisper another joke to his counsel, Christina stood up from her desk. There is a way she moves when she knows she is about to change the weather in the room. She didn't say a word. She just handed me a thin supplemental file, the kind that usually contains the things people try to bury under layers of expensive fabric and public relations stunts. I opened it slowly. I have learned over 40 years that the loudest truths are often found in the quietest documents. This wasn't Julian Thorne's first misunderstanding regarding a lease. The records showed a pattern that stretched back 3 years across 2 different states. 3 prior evictions. 4 documented cases of disorderly conduct involving property managers, and most telling of all, a series of lawsuits where he had sued elderly landlords for emotional distress the moment they asked for the rent he was legally obligated to pay. It wasn't just a lack of funds, it was a calculated business model of harassment. I looked at Julian and asked him if he had ever actually worked a day in his life. He didn't blink. He told me he was an entrepreneur of influence and that his time was worth more than the manual labor of maintaining a property. I felt my father's ghost standing right behind my shoulder then. My father, who poured concrete until his knuckles were swollen and his back was bent, never once felt he was too important to respect the person providing him a roof. Julian's lawyer tried to jump in, claiming that his client's past was irrelevant to the current civil matter. I raised my hand, and for the first time that morning, the room went absolutely cold. I told him that character is never irrelevant in my courtroom. We don't just look at the ink on a contract, we look at the footprint a person leaves in their community. Julian hadn't just occupied a room in Victor's house. He had tried to occupy Victor's peace of mind, and that has a price that no lease agreement can fully quantify. Then came the moment that truly shifted the gravity of the room. Christina handed me a printout from a private group chat Julian managed for his premium followers. It was a strategy guide he sold on how to squat with style and break the spirits of elderly homeowners to avoid paying rent. He called it the legacy hack. He was teaching thousands of young people how to weaponize the law against the very people who had spent their lives building the society he was now consuming. I leaned forward until I could see the reflection of my own gavel in Julian's expensive sunglasses. I asked him if he understood the difference between being smart and being predatory. He didn't answer. He just looked at the clock, clearly frustrated that his influence couldn't speed up the hands of justice. He thought he was playing a digital game where the person with the most followers wins. He didn't realize he was in a sanctuary where the only currency that matters is the weight of the truth. Victor Henderson was watching Julian now, not with anger, but with a profound kind of sadness. It's the look a dedicated teacher gives a student who has failed a test they didn't even realize they were taking. Victor whispered, almost to himself, that he didn't even want the money anymore. He just wanted to know when the world had become so hollow. That whisper carried more weight than all of Julian's designer labels and social media metrics combined. I sat back and let the weight of that silence settle. I have sat through murders and thefts, but there is something uniquely soul-crushing about a person who uses their youth and vitality to prey on the very people they should be honoring. Julian Thorne sat there, a man who had everything but a conscience, while Victor Henderson stood there, a man who had been stripped of his peace but held on to his soul. The scale was about to tip, and Julian had no idea how heavy the fall was going to be. I sat there for a long moment, just looking at the legal team representing Mr. Thorne. They were shuffling papers and adjusting their silk ties, trying to find a way to make systematic cruelty sound like a simple contractual dispute. I have seen many lawyers in my time, and I know the look of a man who realizes he is billing by the hour to defend a sinking ship. Jonathan Pierce leaned in to whisper something to Julian, but Julian didn't even look at him. He was staring at the monitor where the image of Victor Henderson, struggling with a trash bag, was still frozen in time. For the first time, the smirk on Julian's face didn't look so sturdy. It looked like a mask that was starting to itch. I asked Julian a question that wasn't in any of the legal briefs. I asked him if he knew what Victor Henderson had taught during his 30 years at the high school just 6 blocks from this courthouse. Julian blinked, his eyes darting to his lawyer for a lifeline that wasn't coming. He muttered that he didn't see how that was relevant to the lease. I told him it was relevant because Victor Henderson taught American history. He taught young men and women about the sacrifices made by people who had nothing, so that a generation like Julian's could have everything. He taught them that a community is only as strong as its respect for the vulnerable. While Victor was shaping the minds that eventually built the very infrastructure Julian used to broadcast his arrogance, Julian was busy figuring out how to bypass the basic responsibilities of being a neighbor. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a level that forced everyone in the gallery to hold their breath. I told Julian that in this room, we do not recognize digital influence as a form of currency. We recognize character. We recognize the calluses on a teacher's hands and the quiet dignity of a man who has never asked for a handout in 84 years. Christina then handed me a document that had just been transmitted from the city's housing department. It was a list of code violations Julian had filed against Victor over the last 6 months. They were petty, vindictive claims, things like a slightly cracked walkway or a porch light that flickered in the wind. Julian had been using the city's own safety regulations as a weapon of harassment, trying to bury an 84-year-old man in fines so that he would be too overwhelmed to fight the eviction. It was a legal siege designed to break a man's spirit under the guise of tenant rights. I looked at those documents and then I looked at Victor. The retired teacher was sitting very still, his eyes fixed on the seal of the state behind my bench. He looked like a man who was wondering if the world he had taught his students about still existed. I felt a surge of that cold, disciplined anger again. It wasn't the heat of a moment. It was the weight of a legacy. My father didn't come to this country and work in the dirt so that people could use the law to bully the elderly. He believed the law was a shield for the weak, not a club for the entitled. Julian finally spoke up, his voice cracking just a little. He said that he was just playing the game and that Victor should have been more business-minded. He said it as if life were a series of transactions where the person with the least empathy wins. I told him that life is not a game and this courtroom is not a playground. I told him that when you target a man's home and his dignity, you aren't being a businessman, you are being a predator. And predators in my courtroom eventually find out that they are not the ones at the top of the food chain. I noticed the 2 handlers Julian had brought with him, the ones who were recording the session earlier, had stopped their cameras. They were looking down at their laps, suddenly aware that the content they were filming was turning into a record of their own shame. The room felt like it was shrinking around Julian Thorne. The expensive suit and the gold watch couldn't protect him from the fact that he was standing in front of a man who remembered what it was like to have nothing but a name and who intended to make sure that name still stood for something. I asked Victor if he had anything he wanted to say to Julian before I moved toward a decision. Victor stood up, slowly, refusing the help of the bailiff. He looked at Julian, not with the hatred Julian probably expected, but with a quiet, devastating pity. He said, "I don't want your money, Julian. I just want to know who taught you that other people don't matter." That question hung in the air like a ghost. Julian had no answer. He looked at his Gucci loafers, and for the first time that morning, the room belonged entirely to the teacher. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the legal team representing Mr. Thorne. They were still whispering, still trying to find a loophole in a situation where the only hole was the one Julian had dug for himself. I told Mr. Pierce that I had heard his offer to settle for a fraction of the debt, and I asked him to look at me and tell me if I looked like a man who was interested in a discount on justice. You see, the problem with people who think everything is a negotiation is that they eventually forget that some things are non-negotiable. Dignity is one of them. Respect for the elderly is another. You cannot put a price tag on the fear you have instilled in a man who has done nothing but try to provide you with a home. I looked at Julian, and then I looked at the image on the screen one last time. The caption he wrote said that the rules do not apply to him because of his influence. It said that Victor was just a relic who should be grateful to be in his presence. Let me tell you something about the world you think you own, Mr. Thorne. The rules apply to everyone in this room, but they apply most strictly to those who think they are too big for them. My father taught me that when you have power over people, that is when your character is tested, not when things are hard, but when you have the easy chance to be cruel and you choose it anyway. You failed that test every single day you walked past Victor in that hallway and chose to mock his struggle instead of offering him a hand. You told this court earlier that you and Victor Henderson are not equal in any meaningful way. And for the first time today, Julian, I actually agree with you. You are absolutely correct. You are not equal. Victor Henderson is a man of substance, a man of history, a man who has spent 40 years pouring himself into the future of this city's children. You are a man of shadows and screens, a man who doesn't even know how to pay for the roof over his head without trying to destroy the person who provided it. He is worth 10 of you. And it is time you realize that the digital world you live in has no power in this sanctuary of truth. The gallery was silent now, a heavy, expectant silence that felt like the air before a lightning strike. I saw Julian's mother in the back row, and she wasn't looking at the cameras anymore. She was looking at her son with a look of profound disappointment, a look that said all the family money in the world could not wash away the stain of what he had become. I reached for my gavel, not to end the session, but to signal that the time for posturing was over. The law is not just about punishment. It is about restoration. It is about balance. And the scales in this room were about to swing back with a force that Julian Thorne never saw coming. I told Julian to stand up and look at Victor. He didn't want to. It is always easier to insult a person through a lens than it is to face them across a table. But in my courtroom, you will face the consequences of your choices. I saw Victor's hands stop shaking for the first time all morning. He wasn't looking at Julian with anger. He was looking at him with the quiet authority of a teacher who was about to deliver the most important lesson of the semester. I turned to Christina and told her I was ready to read the sentence. Julian's lawyer tried to stand up one last time, but I raised my hand and he sat back down. The time for billable hours had ended. The time for accountability had arrived. I looked down at the sentencing options and then back at Julian. I knew in that moment that a simple fine would teach him nothing. He would pay it by lunch and post a celebratory photo by dinner, laughing about how he had beaten the system. No, some people need punishment, others need education, and a few need both, tied together so tightly they cannot separate one from the other. Here is the sentence. For the underlying violations and the documented harassment, I am ordering the immediate payment of all back rent, totaling $6,000, plus full court costs. But that is only the beginning. Your right to occupy that property is terminated as of 5 p.m. today. You will leave, and you will leave quietly, without taking so much as a light bulb that doesn't belong to you. Furthermore, you will complete 300 hours of mandatory community service. You will not be filing papers in a comfortable office or taking photos for a charity gala to boost your image. You will report to the Providence Senior Center starting tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. You will wear a standard work uniform. You will mop floors, you will scrub bathrooms, and you will serve meals to the very generation you saw fit to ridicule. You will do the hard, invisible work that keeps a community running. Because you chose to weaponize your social media influence to strip a man of his dignity, I am ordering a digital correction. You will post a handwritten, one-page letter of apology to Mr. Henderson on your primary Instagram and TikTok accounts. This post will remain pinned at the top of your profile for exactly 1 year. No comments turned off, no hiding it behind a paywall. If that post disappears for even 1 hour, or if you attempt to mock this sentence online, I will issue a warrant for your arrest for contempt of court immediately. Julian Thorne sat there, And for the first time, he didn't look like an entrepreneur of influence. He looked like a frightened boy who had finally run out of excuses. The room was so quiet you could hear the breath catching in people's throats. The speechless reaction wasn't just about the severity, it was about the balance. For once, the law wasn't just a machine, it was a mirror reflecting his own ugliness back at him. I turned my eyes to Victor Henderson. He was standing straight now, his shoulders back, his hands no longer trembling. I told him, "Mr. Henderson, you spent 40 years teaching children that their actions have consequences and that history is written by those who endure. Today, the city of Providence is your classroom once again. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your patience." He gave a small, dignified nod, and I felt the weight in my chest finally begin to lift as the gallery began to realize that justice still has a backbone. I went home late that evening, more tired than usual. When you carry the weight of a case like that all day, it settles into your bones in a way that sleep cannot easily reach. Joyce was in the kitchen when I walked in, and she didn't even have to ask. She looked at my face and simply said, "A rough one." I hung up my coat and told her everything: the Lamborghini, the mocked elderly teacher, the digital arrogance, and the sentence that finally brought the room to a standstill. Joyce stood there for a moment. Then she said something that stayed with me all night. She said, "Good. He needed the humiliation almost as much as he needed the discipline." She was right. Sometimes, the only way to teach a person about the value of others is to force them to stand in the shoes of the people they once looked down upon. I thought about my father then, and I wondered if he would have been proud of the balance I struck between the law and the human heart. A few months later, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, Christina placed a small, handwritten envelope on my desk. It was from Victor Henderson. Inside was a photograph of him sitting on his porch, holding a book, looking more at peace than I had ever seen him in the courtroom. He wrote that the silence in his house was finally his own again. He didn't mention the money or the rent. He mentioned that his granddaughter had seen the video of the trial and told him, "Grandpa, I'm so glad the world finally saw who you really are." He also told me that he had seen Julian at the senior center. He said Julian didn't look like an entrepreneur of influence anymore. He looked like a young man who was finally learning the weight of a mop and the value of a thank you from a stranger. Julian hadn't become a saint overnight, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't the center of the universe. He was just a person, serving other people, and in that service, there is a kind of healing that no bank account can ever provide. I have been on this bench for over 40 years because I believe that the law is not a machine designed to grind people down. It is a living, breathing thing that exists to protect the dignity of every soul that walks through those double doors. If we lose our ability to feel what it is like to live inside someone else's skin, then we have lost the very essence of justice. Mercy is not a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate expression of strength. It is the refusal to let the world turn us into something mechanical and cold. I am 82 years old now, and I've learned that the cases I'm proudest of are not the ones that made the headlines. They are the quiet cases, the ones where a widow walks out standing a little taller, or a young man finally realizes that his character is the only thing he truly owns. That is the legacy I want to leave behind. Not a list of rulings, but a record of lives that were seen, heard, and respected when they thought the world had forgotten them. If this story meant something to you today, if you believe that accountability matters and that money should never buy a person the right to be cruel, then I have a small request. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that justice still has a backbone. Leave me a comment about a time when you saw power used the right way, because those are the stories that help us keep our faith in each other. Take a look at the next video on your screen, because I have another story waiting for you that explores these same truths. I am Judge Boyd, and I believe that we are all equal before the law, but more importantly, we are all equal in our need for respect. God bless you, take care of each other, and always remember to show kindness whenever you can. The ripples of a single act of dignity can reach much farther than you will ever know.